On January the 7th, 1948, Godman Army Airfield at Fort Knox, Kentucky, received a report from the Kentucky Highway Patrol of an unusual object in the sky over Madisonville. The object was described as circular in shape and approximately 300 feet in diameter and was travelling in a westerly direction. Around 1:45 p.m, Sergeant Quinton Blackwell, along with two other witnesses, were in the control tower at Fort Knox and sighted an unusual white object in the distance and reported it to the base commander, Colonel Guy Hix. Using his binoculars, the commander described the object as being very white and about 1/4 the size of the moon and had a red border at the base of it. At this point, the object was stationary and remained that way for the next 1.5 hours. Meanwhile, 183 miles away, Clinton County Airfield, Ohio, had also spotted the object and described it as having the appearance of a flaming red cone trailing a gaseous green mist and observed it for around 35 minutes. 240 miles away, Godman Army Airfield in Ohio also observed the object and noted, just before leaving, it came to very near the ground, staying down for about 10 seconds, then climbed at a very fast rate back to its original altitude of 10,000 feet, levelling off and disappearing into the overcast sky, heading 120 degrees. Its speed was greater than 500 miles an hour in level flight. As all this was taking place, 4 fighter interceptor jets from the Kentucky Air National Guard were in the air and were fast approaching the object and stayed in radio contact with Sergeant Blackwell throughout the event. The jets were F-51D Mustangs of Sea Flight, 165th Fighter Squadron, and one of the pilots was 25-year-old Captain Thomas Mantell. One of the other pilots was low in fuel and had to return to base, but the remaining pilots, Captain Mantell, Lieutenant Clements and Lieutenant Hammond, continued to pursue the object and draw closer. It was suggested the pilots level their altitude and try to get a better view of the object. Although Lieutenant Albert Clements had an oxygen mask, it was in low supply, and along with Lieutenant Hammond, decided to call off their pursuit at 22,500 feet. Meanwhile, Operations Officer Captain Gary Carter said the round white object was plainly visible in the afternoon sky. At 2:45 p.m, Captain Mantell radioed the tower that had spotted the object at 14,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, he provided the following update. The object is directly ahead of me and above me now, moving at about half my speed. 30 minutes later, Mantell offered another update. It appears to be a metallic object, or possible reflections of the sun from a metallic object, and it is of tremendous size. I'm still climbing. The object is above and ahead of me, moving at my speed or faster. I'm trying to close in for a better look. Captain Mantell continued to climb and continued the pursuit, but unfortunately, in his determination in tracking the object, once Captain Mantell had passed 25,000 feet, it appears he blacked out through lack of oxygen, and his plane started to spiral to the ground. A witness later described Captain Mantell's Mustang as spiraling down in a circling descent. His Mustang crashed on a farm south of Franklin, on Kentucky's border with Tennessee. When firemen later pulled Captain Mantell's body from the wreckage, they found his seatbelt was shredded and his wristwatch had stopped at 3:18 p.m, the time of his crash. As this drama was taking place, by 3:50 p.m, the unusual object was no longer visible to observers at Godman Army Airfield. This event received a lot of publicity, especially following the drama that surrounded Roswell in July 1947, which had happened only 6 months previously, and the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting on June 24, 1947. After the drama, there was the usual cover-up, such as the incident at Roswell, where they claimed it was a weather balloon. As expected, United States Air Force Project Blue Book released a report that Mantell may have died chasing a skyhook balloon, which in 1948 was a top-secret project that he would not have known about. Skyhook balloons were high-altitude balloons that were used by the United States Navy Office of Naval Research in the late 1940s and 1950s for atmospheric research and meteorological observations at very high altitudes. The Mantell incident was reported by most newspapers and received a lot of attention in the media. There were rumours that the flying saucer was an alien spacecraft that had shot down Mantell's fighter plane when it got too close. That Captain Mantell's body was found riddled with bullets. The body was missing, the plane had completely disintegrated in the air, and the wreckage was radioactive. In 1956, Captain Edward J. Ruppel was the first head of Project Blue Book and wrote that the Mantell crash in 1948 helped to define the UFO phenomenon in the public mind and also helped convince some intelligence specialists that UFOs were a genuine phenomenon. Due to the false or negative media releases that surrounded all UFO cases, the press often treated UFO reports and sightings as simply amusing, and witnesses were often mocked. So much so that many people chose to stay quiet after witnessing a UFO and feared for their reputation or being humiliated. By the 1950s, there was Cold War hysteria. There were many movies made about UFOs, showing that they might be not only extraterrestrial, but potentially hostile. Captain Thomas Mantell's deadly flight on January 7, 1948 still remains a mystery, and that he supposedly died while pursuing a UFO over Godman Army Airfield that was seen not only by various military air bases in the region, but also by many people throughout the region that surrounded Fort Knox. In 2005, Larry Barnes was an editor for a Kentucky newspaper called Turret and wrote that on Wednesday, January 7, 1948, when Captain Mantell had had his fatal crash, several hundred calls came into Kentucky State Police offices from concerned citizens at several different locations throughout the morning and early afternoon in central Kentucky, claiming to have witnessed the UFO by 1:15 p.m. on that day. Because there were so many calls, the officers had to alert the Fort Knox military police, who in turn notified personnel at Godman Air Base as the object slowly travelled south from Irvington to Owensboro before reaching Godman. The day is recorded as a typical winter day and weather-wise made for a pretty clear viewing in the skies. Looking for some kind of explanation, they asked astronomers to identify the positions of both Venus and Jupiter in the sky as to what it could have been. The investigation found that Venus and Jupiter would not have been visible during daylight hours, and the weather was excellent for visibility, so they had to be discounted as being the objects in the sky. So Captain Mantell could not have mistaken Venus or Jupiter for the object. The official explanation for Captain Mantell's death was that, based on the position of the throttle and the crash debris, Mantell had likely suffered from oxygen deprivation and passed out at around 25,000 feet. The aircraft continued to climb 30,000 feet before levelling off and eventually taking a high-speed nosedive to the Earth. That may be so, but with many witnesses, both military and private citizens, who all claimed to have seen a UFO in the sky that day, and that Captain Mantell had lost his life pursuing an unidentified metallic object, and not a weather balloon. However, it appears unlikely that UFO had shot him down for getting too close, and there appears no doubt that a UFO was in the skies over Kentucky that day in January 1948.